Welcome to the Coffee House, where in the next hour, former Congressman Father Robert Drinan wants to know, why isn't there an international criminal court to prosecute Osama bin Laden? Plus, whatever happened to global warming, to sweatshops, to the rest of the pre-September 11th policy agenda? And how can environmental and labor groups register their concerns again on the national radar screen? Also, NPR religion correspondent Duncan Moon's been talking to Muslims across America, and he stopped by to share what he's learned. Terrorism and its effects on a family is the subject of Susan Shreve's new novel, Plum and Jaggers, and she's here to talk about it. We've got a poem by Lyubomir Nikolov and music by the Sherwood Blues Band. Welcome to the forum at the Coffee House. If you help enable someone to commit a crime, you too are guilty. That's the logic behind President Bush's war against the Taliban. The Taliban is guilty because it provides a safe haven for Osama bin Laden to train his minions and mastermind his global terror. But war for America is a high-risk strategy. UN Human Rights Commissioner Mary Robinson warns that if U.S. bombing continues, Afghan relief efforts will fail, and up to 7 million people could starve this winter. Who would the world hold responsible? And then there's the very real danger that continued bombing will further radicalize the Pakistani streets and result in a Taliban-like government in Islamabad, armed with a nuclear arsenal. Since it is criminal for the Taliban to permit its territory to be used as a staging area for aggression, why not haul the Taliban leadership before the International Criminal Court and try them, like Slobodan Milosevic, for crimes against humanity? Well, for one good reason. No permanent ICC, International Criminal Commission, exists to try such cases, to try the Taliban or, for that matter, bin Laden. Most jurists around the world think such a permanent tribunal should exist. So too does the American Bar Association and ex-congressman Father Robert Drinan, a longtime faculty member at the Georgetown Law School. I asked Father Drinan if such an international criminal court had existed on September 11th, whether that might have affected the U.S. response.
It would have changed it radically. If we had a permanent Nuremberg, if it was clear that these people, these thugs, these people who invaded our country, that they could be tried and be given a good hearing at The Hague or elsewhere, that certainly would have deterred them, and it would deter the United States from military action.
Let's say that it is Osama bin Laden and his crew that are responsible for this action or could be indicted for it by an international criminal court. But let's say and assume that in reality they would not respect the jurisdiction of this court, they would not appear when subpoenaed. Is it possible for an international criminal court to try in absentia malefactors like the people that committed these heinous crimes?
Well, before we reach that question of in absentia, there's ways of bringing them, as we brought Milosevic from Yugoslavia to the tribunal at The Hague. And there's at least 30 or 40 alleged malefactors now imprisoned or detained. And that if they could not be reached, conceivably it could be done in absentia. There was at least one case of conviction and condemnation by in absentia. However, there's ways in these days of delivering people with international, assuming now that everybody agreed under the International Criminal Commission to the ongoing work of this commission, it would be easy to deliver them. So that's not possible, that's not a feasible resolution. The United States, unfortunately, in my judgment, has declined to enter the International Criminal Commission. I was on a task force of the American Bar Association for many months, even years, structuring the ICC. And in my judgment, the United States was very wrong in June 3 years ago to walk away from signing on to the ICC. It will be ratified. 60 nations very shortly are going to agree to that. It will be in existence, and our absence there is a colossal blunder.
Let's say that we were able to get Osama bin Laden before this international tribunal. Let's say we got a conviction. What kind of enforcement action is available in that forum?
Well, there's very good enforcement. They probably are not going to use the death penalty, but there is life incarceration, and that there's all types of penalties against him, against his associates. In other words, they have all of the attributes of a federal court in the United States under the U.S. Code, except for the death penalty.
Let's say that, again, he refused to appear and we couldn't get him before that court. but we tried him in absentia and got a conviction. What kind of enforcement action could be taken then?
Well, I don't think that's going to happen, because with 60 nations ratifying it, that means that it's obligatory on 191 nations on the earth. And if a particular country refuses to deliver him, there'll be all types of interdicts against that country, which are unsustainable. No country will do that once the ICC is in place.
Let's talk a little bit about the United States' attitude toward the ICC. It was my understanding that the Clinton administration, with reservation, agreed to it. That the Bush administration is pulling back from that, and that they are supporting this American Servicemen's Act. Can you talk a little bit about that and what it does?
Yeah, I think that the Clinton people went as far as they could, but the DOD, the Defense Department, just said, we don't want this because we have thousands of Americans around the world, and that they will be indicted at the local level for alleged offenses. That's a total mischaracterization of the treaty. The treaty says that if you have people who do something wrong in a foreign country, that person will not be touched if you guarantee that he will get a trial back in the place of origin. I lament the fact that Mr. Ashcroft and the new administration is going forward with this rather ill-advised thing that you can't touch any American soldier, however bad he is. If he rapes in Okinawa, you can't touch him. Well, that may be arguably the law already, that we would take him back and trust. But that shows a distrust for the attitudes and the rule of law as practiced by all the other nations of the earth besides the United States.
A lot of people in this country probably share that distrust. How do we know, what do we know about the composition of the tribunals themselves that would be trying these cases?
It'll be multinational. It will be agreed to by all of the participating nations. Only very qualified people will be there. And if you want some example, go to the International Tribunal at The Hague for Yugoslavia, and likewise the International Tribunal for the Crimes of Rwanda. These things are not stacked. You have all of the privileges that you would have in America. You don't have trial by jury. All I know is that for 50 years, the whole world of lawyers and jurists and politicians and churches have said we have to have a permanent Nuremberg. That's just a sensible thing where you have all these nations who want to go their own way and do terrible things. There has to be some type of international punishment.
And if not, Wild Wild West?
You're quite right, that we will have the stronger prevailing. We will have shooting of tyrants, and I think that it's a lawless world unless you have this. And I compare the whole world situation to the United States. We have the Articles of Confederation for the 13 colonies. They weren't working. Consequently, we got a strong constitution where the states have rights, but they also have duties to the entity. Every nation in the earth, when it becomes a member of the United Nations, and they all are, pledges in Article 55 and 56, we will guarantee all the human rights that are embodied in the World Constitution. And that's the same way. It would be helpful. Furthermore, theoretically at least, it would deter terrorism. It would deter wars within a state. And that is just the civilized response to this whole new situation.
Apart from the Defense Department's opposition, there are issues regarding U.S. sovereignty generally, aren't there, and the right of America to control its own destiny?
Well, there's more and more of those, and that we are a member of the World Trade Organization. We get into NAFTA, regulating trade with Mexico and Canada. We have all types of arrangements on the Far East. There's going to be more of those because globalization has changed the whole nature of the earth. There's no way by which we can be isolated. The United States is only 4% of the entire earth. We are consuming 40% of the resources. We look like a bully and we act like a bully, and that's one of the many reasons for the terrorism, that people think that we're arrogant and seeking to impose our own values on others. Actually, there's very good streaks in the American character. It is we who initiated the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights with Mrs. Roosevelt. It is we that helped to structure the 6 or 7 major human rights treaties, and that we are reluctant in other things. We've never been invaded. We have 2 oceans, and that I hope that we're going to learn through the sad things that have happened since September 11th.
That was former Congressman Father Robert Drinan. Far from the World Trade Center and Pentagon rubble, the collateral damage from September 11th keeps mounting. We feel it in a lost sense of security and a deeply shaken economy, and our ability to set a proactive policy agenda. Before September 11th, issues like global warming and a living wage were gathering increasing attention. Post-September 11th, they're off the radar screen. And that troubles Alysondra Campaigne, Legislative Director of the Natural Resources Defense Council. How does a group like NRDC put forth its issues, its concerns in the post-September 11th context? As the Executive Director of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees for the D.C. area for federal employees, Carl Goldman faces much the same problem in getting the public to pay attention to issues of concern to labor. Welcome both of you to the Coffee House.
Thank you very much.
Alys, let's start with you. What is the environment currently for the environment on Capitol Hill? Can you get your issues heard there these days?
Well, it's a good question, and certainly the context has changed dramatically, as it has for all of us, for all Americans, for the kinds of things that the people are interested in. What's been particularly challenging for us is that while the public wants Congress to be focusing on immediate issues of national security, much of Congress is actually pursuing kind of the same old agenda, and we have to find new tools to get our message out. For example, in the beginning of the year, there was a lot of press attention to issues like global warming, to what the administration, the Congress were doing in order to protect public health and the environment. And now using the media as a way to inform the public as to what's going on is much more challenging, as everybody sees. You know, there's not a lot of stories about anything other than the current crisis. And that, coupled with just right now the logistics of finding senators and their staff who are displaced by this anthrax situation, it's definitely given us a challenge that we are working around every day, because we need to stick with our fundamental mission of educating the public about what's happening in Congress, and the anti-environmental agenda that's being driven by many is still very much alive, and we need to make sure that the public is aware of that.
Some of the issues that you've been fighting over for a long time are getting recast slightly. Even before September 11th, the President argued that drilling in the Arctic, for instance, for oil, was an energy security issue. Now it's being pitched in some ways as an anti-terrorism issue. How do you confront something like that without jeopardizing your own claim to patriotism?
Right. It has been a challenge, and it's been incredible, the willingness of some members of Congress to advance this agenda in the guise of it being a national security issue. For instance, drilling in the Arctic refuge, to suggest that that is an issue of national security is purely wrong, that this would in some way reduce our dependence on oil, and that would make us less vulnerable to the current situation with Afghanistan is a huge stretch, both because it would take so many years to get any oil out of the refuge, but more importantly because it wouldn't lessen our dependence on foreign oil at all. Instead, a number of policies that we've been advocating for years, because they make sense for creating jobs, for saving consumers money, and for reducing our dependence on all sources of oil, that we've been trying to get the message out about, things like simply raising the fuel economy of the cars we drive, or improving the kinds of, giving more alternatives of the kinds of fuels that are available as options to oil. So we haven't pitched those in the past as being, we're doing them because of national security, although they do have a very real benefit.
And might you do that now?
Well, we certainly are responding to the debate since we've been forced into it by those who are demanding a vote on drilling in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge. Senators Murkowski and Stevens from Alaska have been putting this bill up into the debate on extraneous issues, and they're going to continue to do so. So as that has been going forward, we are responding, and we are reminding people that tried and true policies that make sense for consumers, make sense for jobs, make sense for the environment, actually do have a bigger security benefit than drilling in the Arctic refuge.
Are there possibly some is there possibly a silver lining to all of this in the post-September 11th universe? For instance, on the question of global warming. You were on the Hill while Congress basically voted 99-0 or whatever against the Kyoto Accords. So even back then, it wasn't as if this was about to pass Congress. But now the president, who began his administration as a pronounced unilateralist on international questions, has been very much engaging the world community in trying to build a coalition against terror. Might not that require him to rethink Kyoto and questions like that when Europe says, well, what about us and our concerns?
Mm-hmm. I think that's absolutely a dynamic that's in play right now, particularly with the issue of global warming, and there are many other issues where it requires an international spirit of cooperation, and we're all in this together in the sense of all of us have been putting greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, none faster than the United States. It simply isn't possible to come up with a solution without having broad participation of all countries. So the administration had already been skeptical about the Kyoto Protocol and had said that it didn't want to support that agenda, but certainly now, as the president has been engaging countries around the world, there are people certainly in the European community, in Japan and in other places, who feel very strongly that this has to be a situation that cuts both ways, and that the threats from global warming are very real for economies, for food security, for low-lying nations. So it's in our global interest, and we imagine that issues like this will certainly get a second hearing as the months advance.
Carl, labor's issues, living wage, sweatshops. How has the environment post-September 11th affected organizing at the grassroots level?
Well, at first, all of us sort of had to stop and take stock. It was a changed environment. People, trade union members, were just as shocked as everyone else in the nation. But we remembered what our mission is, and our mission is to give workers a voice, whether it is internationally or whether it is locally. And so I would say after a few weeks, organizing has picked up. We don't get the same media attention, but media has always been a problem. This is the exception here, of course. But in the last few weeks, there have been very successful picket lines. There was a rally very close to here about a week and a half ago on the living wage, attended by 400, 500, 600 people. There are planning meetings for additional organizing, and so even though the environment has changed, the need for organizing, the need for unions hasn't, so we're just keeping on.
Now, there was also a rally in D.C. not long ago on behalf of parking lot attendants. And that was a rally that had been in the making for some time, got postponed because of September 11th.
Yes.
But then actually was held. Tell me about that.
Well, it was originally just a part of the organizing drive that parking lot attendants have been involved in. But something interesting happened. You know, employers virtually always oppose union organizing drives. But with the events of this past September, some of them have sunk to a new low, and that's what happened in this organizing drive. Maybe about a month ago, one of the union's organizers was in a garage.
Because of September 11th and the environment and atmosphere around that is?
Well, I think using the environment around September 11th to weaken unions, to try to stop unions from organizing workers. That's the new low that they sunk to. And this example, I think, shows that the organizer was in the parking lot talking to workers. There was a manager who wasn't very happy about it. But the organizer talked and went about her business. And 2 days later went home to find out that she had been visited by the police because management of the garage claimed that charged her, claimed that she had made a bomb threat. Now, the police very quickly realized that that was a bogus threat and that was a bogus charge. But what the employer was trying to do was to scare the union, intimidate the workers, to try to stop them from organizing.
And capitalize on the sense of insecurity that permeates the culture right now.
And the reaction to this was that the union moved ahead even stronger with this rally, with increased contacts with workers, and did not let this stop them.
One thing that the analog, I guess, to increasing international pressure on the United States to cooperate on things like a global warming agreement, maybe in the labor context, would be a very changed perception of the public, of public employees, of firefighters, of cops, what have you.
Well, the fact that the heroes of September 11th mainly were public employees. They were firefighters, unionized police officers, EMT workers, and those from the private sector were unionized construction workers. All of a sudden, segments of the population that were looked down upon are now the heroes. And I hate to say that there's any silver lining to the horrible events of September 11th, but this new perception is something positive, because to me it's nothing new. These folks always have been the heroes.
Neither of you are wringing your hands and saying, let's give up, we can't do anything in this environment. On the other hand, what I'm hearing is that this, in many ways, isn't the most auspicious time to be advancing your agenda, but that there are some positive aspects to this. Does it mean that you really have to change the way you organize today as opposed to the way you did yesterday, or is it perhaps maybe a matter of waiting it out for America to mature a bit to its new reality of living with daily insecurity, and that other issues are going to come back on the agenda just because that's the way we live our daily lives?
I think it's a little bit of both. I mean, certainly I agree that the need to get our issues out there hasn't gone away. It's in fact more urgent than ever. We need to keep in place the environmental and public health protections that make this country beautiful and strong in the first place. And that doesn't change, and getting the kind of information that we need to get out to people is as important as it has been. There needs to be a time and place to put out a proactive agenda in a way that the public can engage in. And so finding tools and the time to make sure that the citizenry is aware of what is happening in Congress is really crucial. So beginning to talk about the ways in which some people are using, I'd say, a bit of opportunism here is necessary as we move ahead with an agenda for how we heal the country and move forward. Some
final words, Carl?
Well, organizing has always been difficult, and the key is to look at the situation. We are in a changed situation, and to analyze it and appeal to people's their self-interest, and in our situation, have a voice on the job. And I think if we do that, I'm not saying it's easy, but I think that we have a chance of success.
Well, I want to thank Alysondra Campaigne of the Natural Resources Defense Council, Carl Goldman of Ask Me, and he's also a local official of the AFL-CIO, DC, Maryland, for joining me in the coffee house. Perhaps in time, as we become more accustomed to life in post-September 11th America, other concerns, ones that are every bit as critical to the sustainability of the planet and the durability of the social fabric, will again compete for center stage. Still ahead, NPR's Duncan Moon on Muslims in America, novelist Susan Shreve, the Sherwood Blues Band, and poet Lyubomir Nikolov.
Тежит и светлината легнала по хълмовете плавни и въздухът като олово плиснат към земята те притиска. You are weighed down by the light settling over the hills, and the air like splashed lead presses you to the ground. Everything weighs you down. The clouds full of rain and seeds, the river long and slick as a fish, the stones with inscriptions no longer legible. Your nostrils drink in the valley air, horses and dragonflies in the meadows. This cradle, suspended from the sun and the moon, rocked your father and his father, whole regiments of fathers. Now it's empty, and in the silence you hear words which your grandfather heard from his grandfather, and he heard from some even earlier plowman. Boy, remember that the valleys are grassy casting molds into which the Lord poured our mountains, a wandering of roots and branches. It's time we came to our senses. It's time the river returned to its bed, the word to the stone, plowman to furrows, and the worm to hanging fruit. It's time for the fruit at last to drop down beside its root.
To a second look at the coffee house. They live in foreign places where tourists seldom go. Their politics and religion are largely irrelevant to America. Such were once the stock and trade assumptions about the Muslims of the world, but no longer. Muslims and Islam are of uppermost relevance now. Also, we are suddenly aware that they are strictly not a foreign people. They live next door. They are Americans. Well, long before Muslims became front page news, NPR's Duncan Moon was in touch with their communities in America, and he is here with us in the studio. Welcome, Duncan. How you doing?
Glad to be here.
Well, let's set the stage, actually, globally to start with. We're going to show a map here that situates the Muslim population worldwide. Obviously concentrated not in America.
No, not in America, and not in Europe, although they're growing in both those places. But in South Asia and also in Southeast Asia, I mean, I think most Americans think of Islam as a Middle Eastern religion, as a Middle Eastern phenomenon, and it is that to a certain extent, but I think more than half of the Muslims in the world live in Southeast Asia, in Indonesia, in Malaysia, and places like that. So it's far more than just an Arab religion. And on the other hand, many Arabs, more Arabs than are Christians than Muslims.
But what we know of it, certainly from the front pages now, is that there's hostility toward Americans. I mean, it's death to the infidels. That's the slogan that we hear coming back from the Muslim communities over there. Even in Pakistan, our ally now.
Yeah, I think, and again, these are the pictures that we see. I think they're the pictures that are interesting. They're pictures that are sensational. They're pictures that make it on our nightly news. And there is that sentiment. I think you have to know that in what we'd call the Muslim world, everything is within the context of Islam. Economics, business, religion, politics, all are within the context of Islam. So religious extremism is also within the context of Islam. So you have these really small percentage of people demonstrating, say, in Pakistan, but they're very loud, they're very angry, they're very vocal. And it's a volatile situation. It's something that could turn dangerous, although the military government is very much in control at the moment.
But, well, whether they speak for all of Islam, they have a strong voice over there. And here in America, the Muslims live with a whole different personality, or so it seems.
Well, I think so. I think Islam, the teachings of Islam itself are very peaceful, are very tolerant. Like any religion, there are those who take it to an extreme, who choose only select passages from the Quran or from the teachings of the prophets, who take a fundamentalist and a very black and white view, who take things to an extreme, much the way the KKK used Christianity to sort of bolster and substantiate what they did. I think religious extremists in Islam tend to do the same thing. It's a broader perspective. There's a lot more discontent out there at the moment, and a lot of hatred directed towards the United States. But here in the United States, you have an interesting phenomenon. You have many people who fled troubles in their country, who came from Lebanon when there was war, who came from Iraq when there was hardship there, who were either fleeing dictators or fleeing totalitarian regimes, came here looking for a place to find a job, to practice their religion freely, much like many other Americans. And you have that generation, so they're very different. They see America very different. And then you have a generation that's coming that's their children, which are now college age or younger, who grew up here, who speak English with an American accent, who understand both worlds, and perhaps have a unique perspective, and perhaps sometime in the future play an interesting role in the bringing together of these two worlds.
Yeah, well, and of course they are true Americans in the way that second and third generation immigrants always are. But let's go back, you touched on something. Islam, as a dominant religion, does it take on a different personality than Islam as a minority religion?
Well, I think it does. In certain countries where Islam is well, I guess you call it the state religion. Islam talks very much about politics, and many Muslims around the country would like to have Islamic governments. They say that they can make democracy and Islam come together in some way. There's no separation of church and state, but they believe that they can be democratic. They believe that they can be tolerant. They believe that they can be fair. On the other hand, there's a lot of questioning as to whether that can actually take place, or whether there needs to be some clear separation between church leaders and the politicians that run the countries.
Okay. So as you say, and there everything occurs within the context of Islam. Clearly the Muslims living in America can't take that approach because Islam does not exist outside of their own communities here. So how do they work that out?
Well, they have strong feelings for areas of the world that they've come from. For example, I think many Muslims now are extremely angry about the sanctions that have been placed on Iraq, for example. They think that they may be focused on Saddam Hussein or targeted on Saddam Hussein, but they're not hitting him. They're hitting people, and they think the U.S. had a chance to take out this dictator. No one loves Saddam Hussein, even in the Muslim
community here.
But they say, why didn't you take him out when you had the chance, and perhaps work to put a democratic, some sort of democratic or representative regime in then? Instead, you've left these sanctions in place, and there he is 10 years later with, as UNICEF would say, 500,000 children dying under these sanctions. So that they're torn back and forth. I find many of them are very strongly American. They think of themselves as Americans. They say us the way we talk about America. They say we when they talk about our government. But they look at the ideals of America. They look at what should be fair play and what should be balanced and what should be even-handed. And they don't always see that. And since September 11th, I think they've been a little leery about criticizing the government, about speaking out against U.S. foreign policy, because out of fear of being seen as disloyal or because of some of the backlash that happened to them.
Right. Well, we've seen some evidence of backlash, some evidence of prejudice, I guess a certain amount of violence carried out against individual Muslims, but generally Americans, quote unquote, have seemed to treat the Muslims in our midst pretty well since September 11th. Is that true or not?
Oh, I think that's true. I think it's a big trend. I think we saw the backlash. I think that many Muslims that I've spoken to were very pleased that the president came out early and said, let's make a clear distinction between Islam and the terrorists, a clear distinction between Arabs and terrorists, and was seen at the Islamic Center in D.C. Pretty powerful pictures on the television. They're very happy about that. They think that he made an effort to protect them in a way. They're a little worried about the anti-terrorism bill and loss of civil rights, and they're a little worried about racial and religious profiling. But I think they're really taking a wait-and-see attitude. There was a lot of backlash early on, but more and more I hear people saying that the overwhelming surprise to them was the support that they felt from their communities. People who came to help them clean up their mosques when they were defaced, people who came and sent their wives over from the church nearby to walk with Muslim women when they went shopping, people who were interested in hearing about, could you send over a speaker to tell us about what Islam is and more importantly perhaps what it isn't.
Right, and what it isn't. And they are, Muslims are speaking out more. There are the demonstrations in Times Square, very peaceful, and trying an expression of who we are and what we're about, which is not bin Laden, which is not terrorism, it's something else.
No, I think they've seen, and I think that their leadership has said, look, there's an opportunity here. We need to take this as an opportunity. We need to make something good out of what was horrible and terrible. This is a chance for us to be less insular, to open ourselves to the communities that are around us, to tell them who we are, to tell them who we're not, perhaps to have an open house in our mosque or in our Islamic center. Again, to sort of present people, communicate with people, begin to talk with people.
And they do feel strongly about, well, of course, the Palestinian issue in Israel. I mean, there's no hiding the fact that they feel the U.S. policy is wrong.
Yes, they do, and I think that's very much an Arab as well as a Muslim American,
right.
Arab-Muslim American issue. I think they say that as a Palestinian state, there are the UN long ago has put out votes that said that, you know, this is something that happened. They're pleased that the president is saying that he believes there should be an independent Palestinian state, but they're hoping that it's not just you know, a tactic to try, a political tactic to try and hold this coalition together, but that there'll actually be a plan put in place that perhaps they'll hold feet to the fire on both sides. I spoke to a man in Dubrovnik, Michigan last week who said you need to lock their knees and lock their eyes, meaning get the Palestinians and the Israelis, put them together and force them to make some sort of, come to some sort of agreement here, and that the United States is the only force that can do that.
Certain irony would you say that if it's true that the U.S. government does do a better re-examination of the Palestinian policy in question, that the Muslims of America could play now a more influential role in sorting that policy out?
Well, I think it may come to that. I think their numbers are small
right.
in comparison with Muslims around the world. But you're having a new generation and it's growing, and I think, you know, we'll look down the line, I think, in, I don't know, 20, 30 years, pick a number, when the influence will start to be greater. Yes, I think that's something that happened. It's starting to happen, but it's not a very powerful movement now, I think, basically because of the numbers.
No, right, we're just guessing, but I guess we're all looking for something positive, if not silver linings, just something to say, let's move towards something that creates a better situation.
I heard somebody say something interesting the other day, which I found interesting. They said during the Carter administration, it was seen as a time when evangelical Christians became powerful, when they were brought to the fore. And there's sort of a sense among some that this Bush administration, the second Bush administration, George W. Bush maybe looked as the presidency when Islam began to be looked at in this country as a mainstream religion. I think there's a great challenge for that to happen, but there's also an opportunity, and I think the Islamic communities here are recognizing that and taking whatever steps they can to see if they can bring that to pass.
Wow. Well, the world has changed, America has changed.
And continues to change.
And continues to change. Thanks to Duncan Moon of National Public Radio for your insights. September 11th was a wake-up call, unlike any we've ever experienced. One thing it teaches is that easy assumptions and stupid stereotypes avail us nothing. Muslims are part of America, even as America is now a central part of the Muslim world. That's reality. I'm Howard Cohen, and this has been A Second Look.
Try the whole night long. Well, I roll and I tumble, baby. Try the whole night long. When I woke up in the morning, did not know right from wrong. If the river was whiskey and I was a diving duck, if the river was whiskey, baby, and I was a diving duck, I would dive to the bottom and drink my way back up. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Oh, ho, 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 ho. Luis Arce. Let me hear you. Could have had religion, but I would not go to church. I could have had religion, but I would not go to church. The whiskey and women so gon' get me killed. Take me home, Luis.
Welcome to Writer's Block at the Coffee House. A novel is a mirror that strolls along a highway, wrote Stendhal. Now it reflects the blue of the skies, now the mud puddles underfoot. In other words, the novel, in its truest form, reflects every aspect of life. Susan Shreve's new novel, Plum and Jaggers, opens with a terrorist attack that shapes the lives of her characters permanently. The seeds of their tragedy grow into a collective experience of laughter in the face of pain. Susan Shreve is a professor at George Mason University. She is the author of 12 novels and many books for children. She is also the president of Penn Faulkner, a national award for fiction. She lives in Washington, D.C. Welcome to the Coffee House.
It's wonderful to be here, Lisa.
So this book opens with what kind of a terrorist attack exactly? What?
It's a terrorist attack in a train on the way to Rome, and it's random, and they never find the perpetrators, whether it was one or several, but a number of people are killed, including the parents of the protagonist of this book, and the children are quite young when this happens.
And there's 4 children.
4 children.
Yes.
And their parents are taking them to Rome to connect them to history. These are very optimistic 60s parents.
Right. There's a whole spirit of what's going on for Americans in the 1960s at that time in terms of idealism.
That's right. There was a real sense in this book, and these parents of the age would be the age that I am, and so the age that I was then, did what I did, which was go. I taught around the world and taught in various places, and there was the sense that it was our world, and we were completely free to move about in it, and people were very glad in other cultures to have us there. Mm-hmm. It was a bit of an optimistic point of view.
Yes, well, that was how that time was, and yet these children lose their parents in Italy, and the oldest child is someone named Sam?
Sam, and he's 7, and as the oldest child, he's suddenly burdened with the responsibility he feels of these other 3 children. Mm-hmm. And he makes it his life to hold them together, to hold his family together.
Right, and they go back and live with the grandparents.
With the grandparents, who are a little bit, they're odd, reasonably incompetent people who are very loving, but certainly not in charge of the house.
Right. And Sam is, I mean, I suppose they are all victims of post-traumatic stress, but he's the one who sort of carries the...
He takes it on.
Yeah.
He's the one who remembers what happened. Mm-hmm. He remembers his parents, and the others are younger and don't have a clear picture of them, only really Sam's memory of them. Mm-hmm. But most importantly, he remembers the scene at the train and sitting on the hill and knowing that his parents are dead, in the sense that you ever know at a time of shock.
Right.
And feeling that he has to take care of his siblings.
Yes. And that period is past the 60s, yes?
It's past the 60s.
Yes.
It happened, though the feeling of the 60s sort of extended past its own time.
Yes, I think I do remember that. You were going to read us a little?
I am. I'm going to read this, just a short passage that is about this moment. And the family's called the McWilliams. The year was 1974, the year Richard Nixon resigned, the year Karen Silkwood died in a mysterious car accident after charging her employer, Kerr-McGee's plutonium producing plant, with atomic safety hazards, the year the small terrorist Symbionese Liberation Army kidnapped Patty Hearst. But the McWilliams were citizens of the world, their lives unaffected by events in America. They were optimistic travelers with plans to fill the map of the globe with red dots and lines, connecting all the places they had been and worked and lived. Not without risk. They had been in Munich in Black September 1972, when Palestinian terrorists attacked Israeli athletes at the Olympics, taking 9 hostages and killing 2. They had been in Botswana working with the American Red Cross and were among the white people to shelter the Zimbabwe People's Union forces when they began cross-border guerrilla attacks from bases in neighboring countries. And they had been traveling in the Middle East when the Six-Day War broke out in June 1967, and Israeli forces waged an air and ground attack on Egypt. They believed that they understood danger and could protect themselves from it. And
that really does set up the times that when this is happening. And after the bombing, and Sam is older, he collects terrorist events, right, in the newspaper.
Right, he checks the newspaper just to see the random terrorist event in various countries, and he collects the names, and he collects the stories. He has a scrapbook, and he eventually puts all of these stories up on the wall and uses the names in his comedy routines.
Wow. Now, when you were researching this, you looked into a lot of different terrorist events.
I did. I thought I was going to use the actual terrorist events much more than I did, but I did do the research. In fact, I had a researcher doing the research, and it arrived in reams.
Wow.
And it was really stunning when I look back on it now, in the light of September 11th, to accumulate so many incidences of terrorist attacks throughout the world.
And that you could have almost have predicted.
You had a sense when you were doing this that this was really a very scary time, and the randomness of it. That was what struck me, that any place began to have a feeling of danger when I was writing this book.
Oh, sure.
Subways and buses. Something we're all familiar with right now.
Right, absolutely. And the family become artists. This family, two young men and two young women, led by Sam, who writes the material, and they become a troupe? They become a comedy team
of 4 children whose parents are never at home. And the little comedy shows, which eventually go on television, but are sort of shows that they do around various places like Second City in Chicago. They take place at the dining room table, the sort of family gathering place, and the parents are never there. And there is a bomb under the dining room table, and a sense that at any moment this bomb could explode. The audience is told that there's a bomb under the dining room table.
And so what they've done essentially, and also the name of the comedy group is Plum and Jaggers.
Plum and Jaggers, which was the affectionate name Sam discovered that his parents had for one another. So Plum being the mother.
Yes, and Jaggers the father, because he had a jagged edge or something.
Yes.
So, so what's happened then is they've turned this horrific, horrible event central to their lives into
comedy.
Yes.
And it began in my mind as a story of comedy as a stay against darkness, as the way we have of dealing with the worst of things when things are so terrible, the sense that you laugh until you cry, or you cry until you laugh. And that's what they're doing, and there's a sense of order. They're making little plays out of this family tragedy, and though in the comedy there's no sense that the parents are dead, only that they're never at home, which was a little bit the way of families in the 60s, with mothers rushing out with the women's movement and so forth.
Yes, that whole vibe of a sort of, we've got to change the world is changing around us.
That's right.
And I think you said before we went on camera something about the 60s being a time when we were disconnected from the rest of the world and disconnected from history. Am I saying that right?
I think the 60s were very concerned with the now. That was the sort of vocabulary of the time. And out of that, I think, came a sense of disconnection with the past, just sort of lack of affection for the past that used to be very much in our culture.
Yes.
And in this book, there is the sense that the father is taking them to Rome to connect them with history. They never get there, and they must finally return to the place where they
went through this
event. This sense that the only way that you learn about the future and about your own time is to have some sense of understanding about the past. I mean, it's not, none of us like that,
but it's
but it's
real. Yeah. You know, you have the scene too in Rome with another family. This family
Yes.
that could you just...
This was a family that picks them up, picks up these children, a sort of wonderful, warm, big Italian family in a small village in Italy that picks up these kids and takes care of them just for one night. But that one night is very important. And when Sam eventually feels the need to return to the place that he lost his childhood, they're still there.
Wow.
And he reconnects with them.
It's a beautiful scene. It's very, very nice. Thanks to Susan Shreve for being with us tonight. Her new novel is called Plum and Jaggers. I'm Lisa Page, and this has been Writer's Block.
This is me. And my mom and dad. And my big brother Alex. And Jack. This is the day I learned that sandals got their name from sand. That jellyfish aren't made of jelly. That stars don't just come from the sky. That the ocean is bigger than all of us. This is the day we all got to forget I was sick. This was my wish.
By keeping my car regularly tuned, I save money on gas and repairs. That also means cleaner air. You know, feels good to help save the cash, planet.
The environment. Get green. For more tips, go to getgreen.com.
Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle, King of the Apes, Father of Boy. He knows what it takes to be a dad. You go for a ride, you take a swim, you hang out. All it takes is time. Hey, it doesn't take a hero, but it takes a man to be a dad.
A healthy start means everything. Start when you're pregnant.
Open up your eyes and welcome to the world, little baby boy. I mean a little baby girl.
Get low-cost, even free prenatal care. Call the Prenatal Care Hotline at 1-800-311-BABY. Because you want things to go right. Right?
This is the hand that sows the seed.